On a cold winter afternoon in the Bronx, on one of American sports' most hallowed grounds, two football teams will play. The result of this game will not matter. These teams do not matter, least of all to the 2,000 in attendance. These two programs, located on opposite ends of the country, have nothing to do with one another, nothing in common, barely any shared history. All these two teams will ever have is one failing exhibition game on a cold afternoon in New York. It's a sunny 70-degree afternoon in South Beach, and the Miami Hurricanes and Nebraska Cornhuskers are some of the hottest teams in the nation, skyrocketing to the top of the AP and coaches poll, set to face each other in the Orange Bowl for a shot at glory, a national title. Both programs have found themselves in the same position, yet their journey to the Orange Bowl has been far from uniform, with the only thing in common being their origin point. The Gotham Bowl was, in retrospect, a horrible idea, which was why it only lasted for 2 years. The idea of a bowl in Yankee Stadium has since been revived by the Pinstripe Bowl, but the early 60s simply wasn't the time for it. Nebraska would leave the Bronx the winner of a tight game, earning their new coach Bob Devaney and the program as a whole their first taste of postseason success. What followed can only be described as pure domination. In the afterglow of Bud Wilkinson's Oklahoma dynasty, Devaney picked up the pieces and reconstructed an entirely new Midwestern empire, going on to win the program's first national title in 1970, to then run it back all over again in 1971. Devaney would soon after retire, elevating his offensive coordinator and protege Tom Osborne to the head gig, keeping Nebraska at the forefront of Plains football up until 1983, where they find themselves, yet again, number one in the nation, in prime position to take yet another title back to Lincoln. Miami, despite being the home team, found itself with a much bumpier road to the Orange Bowl. The Gotham Bowl would be one of the final games longtime Hurricanes head coach Andy Gustafson would coach. What followed was a series of okay to abysmal coaching tenures that all but cratered the program. Already struggling to maintain an identity in a pro sports city, the University of Miami's athletic department was forced to make a tough decision by the end of the 70s. Deprioritize sports, or make one last Hail Mary hire. Enter Howard Schnellenberger, a longtime offensive coordinator in both college and the pros, pacing the sidelines alongside the likes of Bear Bryant and Don Shula, and helping coach the Dolphins through their undefeated 1972 season. There were few, if any, people in the nation more qualified to revive the Hurricanes than Schnellenberger. Under his leadership, Miami locked down the increasingly talent-laden South Florida region, brought a fresh pass-first playbook to the offense, and finally brought some discipline back into conditioning. After a rough 1979, he'd bring Miami back to the postseason for the first time since the late 60s, finishing off Virginia Tech in the Peach Bowl. Schnellenberger had the program, at last, on the right track, and 1983 is looking to be their breakout year. Despite a slow start against the Gators, they had finished off the year outscoring their opponents 282-106, along with a 10-1 record, by far Miami's best season, which in turn brought them to their first Orange Bowl berth in 33 years. All that work just to earn the right to another home game. Number 5 in the AP poll, if the upstart Hurricanes can pull off the upset, there's a very real chance the national title stays in Miami for the first time in program history. All that stands in the way is Tom Osborne and the Nebraska Cornhuskers.
This is it, the national championship of college football. Miami, Florida, a city of light for the golden anniversary of the Orange Bowl, and the weather in South Florida is just right for this.
The task ahead is daunting for Miami. Their opponent will boast the highest scoring offense in the nation at 624 points scored in the regular season, an average of 57 points per game, in large part thanks to the perfection of their signature formation, the I formation. Implemented under Devaney and perfected under Osborne, the base formation involves a pair of receivers, a single tight end, and a halfback-fullback duo in the backfield. The idea is to position the halfback far upfield to scout for routes, while the fullback remains on standby to block in whatever direction the halfback chooses, simultaneously keeping pass options open to keep a defense on its toes. Today, the offense will be helmed by Heisman running back Mike Rozier, who introduces himself to the dominant Miami defense with two of the longest runs Miami's allowed all season, ending the drive in a long field goal. Now with the Hurricanes in prime position to answer back, Schnellenberger's offense is put on full display. Never truly forgetting his time with the Dolphins, Schnellenberger would bring with him an early incarnation of the pro-style offense to the college level. Ironically, he'd also employ the I formation, yet instead of making use of the dual backs to create an effective ground attack, he can make use of the two backs for additional blocking, giving the quarterback, in this case Bernie Kosar, time to line up a shot and take it. Soon enough, Miami would find itself in striking distance of the end zone, ending the drive with the game's first touchdown. Through this drive, Nebraska's Achilles heel is exposed. Their run-first conference competition has left them vulnerable to a competent passing game, and sure enough, the Hurricanes would expose this weakness to go up 17-3 to end the quarter. Yet the Blackshirts would stiffen up in the second, and their offense would respond in kind to cut the deficit down to 3. It's a resilience built up by a modern strength and conditioning program, one of the first of its kind in collegiate athletics, and one that quite literally built both the Vaney's and Osborne's dynasties. As the Orange Bowl enters halftime, the 11-point underdogs remain 3 points above Goliath, and seem set to put the game away in the third. Yet, like clockwork, the Husker defense stiffens back up in the fourth, and the offense once more regains control of the field. Soon, Miami's third quarter lead dwindles from 14 to 7 to finally 1. And Tom Osborne has a decision to make. Kick a PAT and tie the game, or go for 2 and risk it all. This Orange Bowl is 12 years before overtime was implemented into NCAA football. If the PAT is good, this game will likely end in a tie. And with second-ranked Texas falling to Georgia earlier in the Cotton Bowl, a tie would ensure Nebraska's third national title, Osborne's first as head coach. Years after this game, Nebraska's starting quarterback Turner Gill will go on to divulge that Osborne ran through this exact scenario with his players before the season and asked what choice they would want to make. The choice in the locker room, supposedly, was unanimous.
And what are
they doing? I have not seen the kicker come on the field, and I don't think he's coming on the field.
This is for the national championship for Nebraska.
5 years prior, the University of Miami's football program was on the brink of being shuttered, joining the ranks of the Chicago Maroons and Santa Clara Broncos, once great programs lost to the sands of time, forgotten as their glory days fell further and further from sight. Yet, in a miraculous resuscitation, Howard Schnellenberger has done the impossible, and the Miami Hurricanes are 1983's unanimous national champions. The Nebraska Cornhuskers will leave Miami with a heart-wrenching loss, yet one they'll soon have the opportunity to redeem. Five years later, Miami and Nebraska would find themselves once more in the Orange Bowl. The years in between were kind to both programs, yet in very desperate ways. The Hurricane savior would leave shortly after the '84 Orange Bowl to try to get in on the ground floor of the newly founded USFL, planning to buy the brand new Spirit of Miami football team, a plan that eventually fell through. In Schnellenberger's place would come Jimmy Johnson, and despite a slow start, his program would prove just as dominant as his predecessors, making the de facto title game twice and winning it all the previous season. More impactful than his wins and hardware, however, was the culture he built alongside it. Johnson would do something no other program around him would dare to do: embrace the personalities he brought into his team, going as far as to implicitly allow for some showboating and celebration. It was controversial at the time. To some, Miami became an unsportsmanlike collection of temperamental brats, and to others, Johnson's program was one of the first on the college level to treat players like people, to embrace their personalities rather than grinding them down for the sake of team cohesion. It was a fierce rejection of the traditional status quo, One put on full display earlier this season in the infamous Catholics versus Convicts matchup against Notre Dame. It's a status quo that Nebraska, more so than the majority of programs, embodied. Going into this game, Nebraska is largely the same as it ever has been. A Midwestern giant with a run-first offense led by Tom Osborne. Yet, as their native Big Eight has shifted towards more passing offenses, the Nebraska defense in turn has gotten slightly more efficient at shutting down an air attack.
Osborne and the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Osborne looking to avenge that loss 5 years ago. Now let's go back to the Fiesta Bowl, the Dick Enberg.
The game opens with Miami's offense, one still adhering to Schnellenberger's pro-style philosophy, and one Nebraska is finally able to shut down as their opening drive stalls near midfield. Out comes the Huskers in their trusty I formation. Yet unlike Schnellenberger, it's the defense where Johnson's most impactful influence on the Hurricanes playbook is felt. The Miami 4-3 is an alteration of the base 4-3 defensive scheme, with the sole focus of swarming the quarterback, making use of speedy linebackers bunched behind the D-line to create pressure. It's most advantageous when there's a dominant O-line that makes it difficult to force mistakes, a key strength of this Nebraska offense. Done right, not only is the QB constantly hurried, but the running game becomes a non-factor. The Huskers would end up going 3 and out on the first drive around their own 10-yard line, setting up All-American quarterback Steve Walsh with ideal field position. And soon enough, Miami would find itself once more drawing first blood against Nebraska as Walsh connected with his favorite target, receiver Leonard Conley. Another Husker drive, another 3 and out, and the Hurricanes would maintain their 7-point lead going into the second quarter. Unlike their matchup 5 years prior, however, the Huskers would fail to put it together, going into the half down 20-0. It was clear that changes needed to be made to combat Johnson's suffocating defense, changes that never seemed to materialize. The Miami 4-3 defense does have one major weakness. It throws so much at the quarterback that if a big play were to occur downfield or on the perimeter, the defense could do little to prevent the ball carrier from picking up major yardage. It's a weakness Notre Dame exploited earlier in the season, yet it's one the Nebraska offense is simply not built for. The second half would consist of both offenses being shut out, both only able to muster a field goal each. The 1989 Orange Bowl would end 23-3. Despite having the opportunity to have national title aspirations, Notre Dame's decisive win over Florida State would all but ensure a title would stay in South Bend, and South Beach would retain its spot at number 2. Despite yet another loss, Nebraska would soon enough be back in the Orange Bowl, and when they came back, a shot at a national title would once more be in the cards. Three years later, Miami and Nebraska are back in the postseason pitted against one another. Like the previous gap between Orange Bowls, Miami once again had some coaching turnover to deal with as Jimmy Johnson left South Beach for the Dallas Cowboys, who themselves are around 30 days away from winning a Super Bowl. Johnson's replacement would be Dennis Erickson, a hot commodity after turning around both Idaho and Washington State's football programs prior to landing the top spot at Miami. After 2 straight national title winning coaching gigs, Erickson's expectations were about as high as they got. Expectations he responded to by winning a national title his very first year. That's the amazing thing about this particular dynasty. Often a program is built around a coach, and once that leader is gone, the program regresses. Not so with Miami. Each coach laid the groundwork that the next one could build upon without losing much of anything. Schnellenberger built the recruitment strategy and offense. Johnson built the culture and the defense. All Erickson needed to do was steer the ship in the right direction and keep the wins coming, which he did. Going into this game, the Hurricanes are once more the team to beat. Nebraska, on the other hand, is largely having an off year, managing to win the Big Eight, but racking up a loss and a tie in the process. They're all but removed from the national title conversation, yet their odd postseason pairing with Miami gives Osborne and his squad a prime opportunity to spoil the Hurricanes' title aspirations. Those hopes quickly hit a brick wall as the game begins with the Nebraska 3 and out deep in their own territory. This Hurricane squad is built upon the power of their defense, allowing an unbelievable average of 9.1 points per game. Like in years past, Nebraska's offense simply isn't built to go toe-to-toe with the Miami 4-3. Like in years past, Miami takes advantage of a weak pass game, And like in years past, the Hurricanes find themselves in the end zone first, going up 7-0. Throughout this game, the Husker Blackshirts will attempt to make it competitive, holding Miami to 22 points by the end of the third quarter. Yet the offense would be nothing but anemic. No comeback would end up materializing. The most notable thing to happen in the last moments of this game would be a fire in NBC's control room in the fourth quarter, forcing the channel to switch over to a Japanese stream for the game's final moments. Miami had convincingly won its fourth national title, half of which being at Nebraska's expense. Tom Osborne's reputation was set in stone. He was a man unable to win it all. Clemson in 1982, Miami in 84, Georgia Tech in 91, now Miami once more in 92. All would end up either sharing or winning a national title outright, and all faced and beat Nebraska in the postseason to put them over the edge. The Cornhuskers are one of the most consistently solid programs of the 70s and 80s. Tom Osborne, since being handed the keys in 73, has finished in the AP Top 25 every single year, often in the top 10, and often with a shiny new Big 8 title. That's what this team was, a program built to dominate its conference, beat Oklahoma, and that's about it. It's a good place to be, but if Nebraska was to be anything else, something will need to change. In the 3-year gap between their last game, Nebraska never left the Orange Bowl. In both postseason matchups, Miami was not present. In the Hurricanes' place was rival and fellow Floridian program Florida State. In '93, a title was not in the cards. The Sugar Bowl between Miami and Alabama would serve as that year's pseudo-championship. In '94, however, a national title was once more on the line, and despite coming closer than they've been since '84 at finally getting over the hump, finally bringing the title back to Lincoln, a last-second field goal would seal their fate once again. The narrative that haunted the Cornhuskers only grew stronger. They could not, no matter what, win the big game. Speaking of the big game, welcome back to the Orange Bowl. Once more entering onto the field is an undefeated Nebraska squad fresh off of yet another Big 8 title, and entering alongside them are the Miami Hurricanes, the number 3 team in the nation with a near-perfect record. At stake is the 1994 national title. At stake is the 1994 national title, and the pride of the Midwest snake-bitten program. The game opens as most every one of these games open, with Miami drawing first blood with a 44-yard field goal, at least ensuring the Hurricanes wouldn't immediately find the end zone, thus bringing out the Nebraska offense. In some ways, it's the same as it ever was, a run-first attack based out of the I formation. Yet the ascent of Brooke Behringer and Tommy Frazier would begin to shake up the traditional Cornhusker scheme, with both being talented through the air as well as on the ground, providing more depth to the offense. Occasionally, though, it leads to something like this.
Walks it downfield. Muhammad, double covered. Interception made by Carlos Jones.
Miami's offense, helmed by QB Frank Costa, is back out onto the field, and a couple breakout plays later, the Hurricanes would, once more, be the first to reach the end zone, going up 10-0. Just as the game begins to once more get out of hand, though, the Nebraska offense would drive down to the field early in the second and reach the end zone. Their first touchdown against the Miami defense since 1984. Both defenses would hold, and they'd exit the first half with a 3-point game on their hands. In the Nebraska locker room, Tom Osborne would speak to his team.
Get it done. Don't let anybody ever lose confidence. We're going to get it done. It's going to happen. And it'll happen late in the ball game probably. If we keep going, we're going to be all right. We still haven't got a turnover, I don't think, do we? Let's see if we can't get a couple, 3 turnovers this half. Fellas, now one last thing. Listen to me. I'll promise you this. If you guys will get your hands down, they're going to get a critical penalty at a time that's going to kill them. We do not want the dead ball foul. You understand that? So I don't want anybody being a panty rooster. I don't want anybody pushing or shoving because it's going to be 2 flags and offsetting penalties.
Part plan and part prediction, Osborne would anticipate Miami, whose laid-back culture was known for materializing on the field as flags, would commit a personal foul, and his men could not react. Miami would start with the ball in the second half and would soon begin marching down the field, first by inches and then
Costa's pass to a wide open Harris. Jonathan Harris cuts back
to the outside.
A 44-yard receiving touchdown from Jonathan Harris would extend the Cane lead by 10, once more putting the Huskers on the ropes. In the past, this is where the game would be lost. Miami would pull ahead as their Midwestern rivals would fall further and further behind. An Osborne squad would, now and forever, remain the jobber to the dynasties of the 80s and 90s. Despite starting out with excellent field position, the Nebraska offense under Behringer would once again stall out. Out comes Costa once more. And then
Stewart on the delayed handoff. Flag, a late one coming in. That'll be the 9th penalty against the Hurricanes. Well, actually,
a personal foul, the 9th Miami penalty of the game, and one the Blackshirts would capitalize on immediately with the ever-elusive championship safety. Sure enough, Osborne was right. After taking the field again, however, Behringer would once again stall out, forcing Nebraska's X-Factor off of the bench. And in combination with an increasingly gassed Miami defense, Frazier would get to work dicing up Miami's formidable, seemingly impervious defense.
play action fake. Tommy Frazier lifts it across the middle. 11-3 as a Penn win for national championship voting. Mark Phillips breaking tackles to the 20 with a cutback to the 15-yard line.
The Blackshirts would hold, and for the first time since Devaney, after 23 heart-wrenching years, a title belonged in Lincoln, Nebraska. The Huskers' sidelines were electric, especially in comparison to their coach, seemingly just relieved to get it over with. The year belonged to them, and soon, for the first time since the Bronx, Miami and Nebraska would go their separate ways. Seemingly freed by finally getting the monkey off their back, Nebraska would come storming back in 1995, with Tommy Frazier coming into the role as starting QB with an unbelievably dominant performance, helping lead Nebraska's offense to a staggering 48 points per game going into the championship game, finally leaving the Orange Bowl to travel out to Arizona instead. Except for once, the Hurricanes were nowhere to be found. Shortly after the '95 Orange Bowl, Miami would once more lose their top guy to the pros. Soon after, we'd find out a reason why. Miami was under probation by the NCAA for recruiting violations dating back to the Jimmy Johnson era. Turns out it'd take a little bit more than scouting to lock down South Florida's recruits, and in response, the Hurricanes would be locked out of postseason play and sanctions would be levied. And like that, the U would finally begin to regress after more than a decade of blinding success. Nebraska would instead face another Floridian team, this time the Florida Gators in their first championship berth, blowing them out 62-24 to claim their second national title in a row, their fourth overall. Osborne's final ride would come in 1997. They'd once more find themselves in the Orange Bowl, playing for a title. This time against Peyton Manning's Volunteers, coming out the victor and splitting the national title with fellow undefeated team Michigan. And like that, Tom Osborne's quarter-of-a-century-long career as Nebraska's head coach, a career that spanned most of the saga, racking up the 6th most wins of any coach in the history of college football, ended. And in his place stepped running backs coach Frank Solich, and the final chapter of this rivalry was set. The 2001 season would unknowingly be the final swan song for the late 20th century's top programs, as Miami and Nebraska found themselves on yet another title-deciding collision. The Huskers would get there through Heisman quarterback Eric Crouch, with over 2,600 combined yards of offense alone. Miami would get there with one of the greatest defenses of all time, clearing everything in their wake en route to yet another title game. This time, the stage wouldn't be in the Orange Bowl, with the Hurricanes set to step foot in sunny Pasadena, California for their very first Rose Bowl. Alongside them would be an old friend. The late 20th century would see various rivalries of circumstance, two good teams that just so happened to be good at the same time, and Miami, Nebraska might very well just be that. What differentiates it for me, however, is what these two teams are, what they represent, and what they brought to the world of college football. On one end is a Midwestern power, a program in operation since the 19th century, one whose culture is traditional and stratified, whose ground and pound offensive ideology is even more so, and one that found success. On the other end is a Southern New Blood, a program on the forefront of a state that, in breakneck pace, went from a forgotten backwater to a cultural hub in the span of a couple decades. A program who empowered the individual, made them stars, one with a high-flying offense that had only become more common as the years went by, and one that found success. This is not to say that Nebraska did not change or innovate. They did so plenty, or that Miami was nothing but trailblazers. It's to say that these two programs are the opposite of one another, in scheme and philosophy and culture, a battle between the past and future of college football, one that often held the entire season's fate in the balance. College football's yin and yang, one that had very little time left. Through a combination of personnel decisions that, in the nicest way possible, did not break the right way, and the wider world of college football cannibalizing the innovations that kept these programs on top, Miami and Nebraska would soon fall from the echelons of football to wander. They'd enter new conferences, have highs and lows, yet have never regained what they had here. This series did not begin in the Goffin Bowl. It was their first postseason game, but it was not their first matchup. In the early 50s, they'd play at home and home, with the home team winning both games. They played unranked, and both seasons refused to amount to much. 12 years after this Rose Bowl, they'd play again in the regular season, another home and home. Yet again, the home team would win both games, and yet again, neither season would amount to much. A final note for two teams that ruled the closing hours of the 20th century.